Welcome to the Behavioral Groups Podcast. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We interview interesting people in order to unlock insights into behavioral science and how we can apply them to work and life.
We are proud to announce that this Behavioral Groups episode is sponsored by the Lantern Group and Behavioral Alchemy.
Woo!
Leaders in the application of behavioral sciences working with best-in-class organizations from around the world. And as one of their clients said, or maybe just thought, or maybe we just dreamed it, don't leave for work without them.
Okay, well, in this episode, we spoke with Mark Horwitch, partner for Co-Creation Flexibility Openness Vision at Bain Company. Mark is an untraditional guy with an untraditional path, most notably marked by a degree from Harvard in visual and environmental studies.
Whoa.
Yeah. And to his current leadership position at one of the highest regarded management consultancies in the world, Bain.
Yeah. And Mark was chosen to develop Bain's new model for leadership. He and his group examined thousands of leadership models, pretty much found them lacking. So they then went ahead and looked at hundreds of different leadership characteristics to hone those down into 32 unique ones that the research found really drove leadership effectiveness. Now, the interesting part about our conversation is that we don't have to be experts in all 32 of those leadership characteristics. We actually, yes, we actually, if we get 4 of them, we are going to be really inspirational leaders. And even just 1 or 2 puts us well above the bar. As you're listening to this, please go out and see the model. You can see a link in the show notes, or you can go to www.bainleadership.com/leadership-model/.
That is, of course, unless you're driving. And then you ought not go out and look at this.
Thank you. Thank you. We don't want to make anybody dangerous in their driving habits.
No. Okay. But with all this effort, we asked Mark about the Peter Drucker model of management. We asked him whether it was dead. And Mark's comments may surprise you. Another theme in our discussion with Mark was his commitment to authenticity. It's evident in the way he talks about his responsibilities at work and in the way he talked about music. The KINKS is one of his favorite bands. And by the way, it's a group that's not exactly known about being shy about their disposition.
Yeah, well, and neither is Mark.
Well, there you go.
All right. So everybody, please listen up. If you enjoy this, please go out and like it. And it's what all the cool kids are doing, when they're hanging out at their 5 and dimes. Who writes this
stuff? Yeah, we got to get a better writer on
Yeah, I
this
guess
stuff.
so.
Yeah,
Anyway, please enjoy this great session with Mark Horwitch. Mark Horwitch, welcome to Behavioral Grooves. We are excited to have you here.
Yeah, welcome.
Thank you.
We are very excited to have you here, and we're going to start with a little speed round. So unsolicited, unprepared, short answers. So tell us, going up the mountain or coming down?
Which do you prefer?
Going up. Going up.
Picasso or Da Vinci?
Da Vinci.
Corporate hierarchy or no corporate hierarchy?
No corporate hierarchy.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you for that. So the reason be for Picasso over Da Vinci over Picasso? What's just the style, or?
I love art. I love aesthetics, but I also like the outcome of what you apply those to be useful in one way or another.
Okay. Fantastic.
Interesting. So you think there's some utility in art? Do you think there's some emotional utility that goes along with art?
Oh, absolutely. I think first of all, that's, for me anyway, that's the whole point of it, is to generate some type of emotional reaction or feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And flipping that around in the corporate context that I work in, I've always been a big believer that there's many different ways to solve a problem. The more elegant and emotionally appealing your solution is, the more likely it is that people will want to follow you and change what they need to change to do that. So
very interesting. Well, and in looking at your background and history and prepping for this, noticed that you have your undergraduate degree from Harvard in visual and environmental studies. And I just wanted to help us understand, or help our listeners understand, what is visual and environmental studies?
Well, with the caveat that that was many, many years ago when I was
Fair enough.
when I was there. At least at the time, that was an honors only major that was designed for people who wanted to pursue a career in one way or another in the arts, the visual arts or architecture. And my primary interest was in architecture. And so I thought that would be a great way to get introduced to some of the core skills and thinking that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Buckminster Fuller's comment about don't change the man, change the environment. And so that's kind of what came to my mind, where the environment is deeply influential in our behaviors. And I know that I don't think that Fuller was necessarily speaking to all of that, but it sounds like you might have been keying into that.
Absolutely. I'm a big believer that your environment has those effects and can have a huge influence. And a lot of what I've tried to do in the situations where I have influence over that is make sure that the environment is as conducive to free thinking and creativity and innovation and triggering intrinsic motivation as possible.
Very cool. So help us, Mark, help us understand your journey then from the architectural focus and the visual and environmental studies at Harvard to being a senior partner at Bain. And what was that journey like? What were those inflection points that got you on there? Because it doesn't seem like that's a natural progression.
Yeah, in hindsight, I think I've been able to piece that together, but I have to say along the way, there was quite a bit of making decisions that were in front of me in the best way I could. But I know this may sound quite mundane, but the initial shift in that path was when I was in my late junior year, starting to apply to architecture graduate programs. And in the course of doing my due diligence and talking to a lot of architects, I became highly disillusioned by the amount of airtime they spent complaining about the profession being low paying, uncreative, subject to the whims of developers, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so I in my naive, young 20s frame of mind, I said, oh, well, so maybe I should actually learn how to be a developer. And if I want to do that, I probably need to learn business. So instead of going to architecture school right away, I changed my mind and said, I'm going to go to business school and learn real estate development. Then I'll get my architecture degree, and then I'll have both, and I'll be able to do what I want.
Okay.
And you end up as a senior partner at Bain and have nothing to do with developing.
Well, I wouldn't say I have nothing to do with developing, because it turns out in my career at Bain, I've had one of my focus areas turned out to be working with large real estate developers and REITs and people like that. So there was ultimately some business convergence there, not necessarily in the same vein, but again, I guess it was my practical nature that kicked in, because the way I ended up at Bain was the year I graduated from business school, there was a big real estate depression in the US, 1980.
Yep.
And all of the developers that used to hire all these bright young MBAs that I could have gone to work for stopped hiring. And at that point, my choice was, well, I guess I could go back to architecture school, but that's another 4 years of school. I'm kind of burned out after 18 straight before that.
Yeah.
And actually, just by accident, a friend of mine had started working at Bain, which at that point was still a very young startup company, and said, you really like solving problems that are complicated. You really like creating solutions that are elegant but also functional. like that's what Bill Bain talks about all the time, is what we're supposed to be doing. So you might want to consider working at Bain. You might really like it, and they might really like you. So long story short, after several rounds of interviews, I finally did meet Bill Bain, who just passed away, by the way, a couple months ago. And that was exactly what he articulated. And you know, it was a very funny interview, because he started out by asking me kind of what you guys did, like what is visual and environmental studies, and how does that have any relationship to what we do? And so I said, well, I'm not really sure, because I've never done what you do, but here's my thinking about it from what I've heard. And he looked at me and put a big smile on his face and said, you know, you're the first person I've interviewed who actually seems to understand what I'm talking about. You know, do you want to work here? And that was that.
Wow. Wow. That is cool. Now we absolutely want to be talking about your leadership model, but
Sure.
I have to go back on this corporate hierarchy or not question. You said no corporate hierarchy. Can you expand on that a little bit? This sounds interesting.
Well, since you gave me a choice of all or nothing, I certainly don't like excessive corporate hierarchy, and frankly, I think hierarchy anymore isn't even necessarily what most high functioning companies have, you know, in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
So you know, if I had to pick one or the other, I had to pick none. I don't think I'm a total believer yet in holacracy and some of the things that people are experimenting with, but
Right.
but I do feel strongly that the more you can structure your organization to allow people to spread their wings, you know, follow their passions, as I said before, you know, do things that actually are consistent with their values and support their fulfillment of intrinsic motivation as much as possible, I think you end up having a lot more interesting outcomes. And you know, if you can somehow get that structure to include in people's minds, you know, some of the business outcomes that you know you need, even if it's really just self-serving, like if we don't get to a certain level of profit, we can't afford to do X, which is, and if the X is what people are really excited to do, then you know, making the outcomes happen that are necessary to do that become part of what is motivating. So hopefully you create a virtuous cycle.
Yeah, well, you know, Jeff Dunkirk founded Morningstar Foods with this very specific intent to never have a corporate hierarchy, and you know, he built
Right.
a huge corporation out of it, a very successful organization as well. So, but it is about harnessing that intrinsic motivation, and I think underneath it all, you got to have really good people. You got to have
good processes, and I think
processes. Yeah.
The other interesting piece of this, and we're going to get to we met, just for our listeners' sakes, we met in a conversation around a leadership model that you have developed. And I think the component here of a hierarchy, that the leadership model isn't about being a leader from a positional perspective, but a leader of people, and regardless of your role or model. Is that, I'm not misconstruing this, am I?
No, that's totally correct.
Yeah. And so I think from that perspective, you know, this is part of, you know, those organizations, as you said, that the more that you can get leadership spread throughout the organization, the more powerful and more, as you said, that business component within it, as well as tapping into people's intrinsic and just having a better work experience is going to be more positive for that. And with that, Mark, then I'm going to lead into, you know, the questions. So help us understand what you do, and then what led you into building and kind of developing this leadership model,
this particular model, because it's not the standard approach.
Yeah, so the background of this really came out of our own thinking in our partnership at our board level around what do we think Bain and Company should be doing to further our interest in being the best place that anybody would want to work, which has always been a strong part of our cultural motivation. And the war for talent, of course, is kind of demanding that you differentiate yourself more and more if you want to be able to attract and retain and motivate the best people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's always kind of on our radar screen. And if you look at Glassdoor and many of the other best places to work kinds of ratings, we are rated incredibly high, which is amazing when we're up against sort of places that people would think of as more cool, like Google and Facebook and others. So we're very, very proud of that. It's really important. And when we, a few years ago, when we were doing our review of this and kind of collecting the feedback from the firm about what could we do to continue to up our game, we were hearing from lots of different directions, interestingly, not just partners, but we were hearing people say things like, I'm not as clear as I used to be on what I'm supposed to be sort of learning how to do if I want to sustain this type of, the type of career and the type of intensity that our industry demands. We heard things like, I'm starting to wonder if the things that motivated me, and this was from the more senior people, if the things that motivated me to want to join this company and make it great, they don't seem to be resonating as well with all the people that I'm mentoring and trying to help. And I don't really understand that. From more junior people, we were getting, not unlike many other companies, people coming saying, well, don't tell me what I need to do to be successful at the company. Let's start with, what am I going to gain by working here?
Oh.
What are you going to teach me that is useful? And Bain's premise, or promise to people really was, you come to Bain and you'll learn how to be the best general manager out there. You'll build your general manager skills, and whether you stay at Bain or go on to something else in your career, those will be incredibly valuable. And that was just did not seem to be a sufficiently exciting answer for a lot of our more junior people. And so we started to have this question mark around, well, are we, what's really the underlying question they're answering?
Mm-hmm.
And what should we do about it? Or is there something we can do about it? Now, the way I got this assignment goes all the way back to what I just said around being an architect or not, and liking unstructured problems and how to figure out what they are and what to do about it. So when this came up as one of the strategic things that we needed to sort of look into, and as one of the senior partners in the firm, I got all these people kind of like pigeons on a fence. All of a sudden, everybody's head turned to me and said, "This sounds like something you'd really like to do, right?"
I love that.
Because we don't have any idea what anybody's talking about. So, are you willing to kind of take this on? And frankly, I was super excited about it because I'm one of the very few partners at Bain to have been lucky enough to also have served as a CEO in a couple of companies, when I was outside of Bain in the middle of my partner career.
Yeah.
And so, so Bain is a unique place where people come there and they're super highly motivated. Like when you talk about the 1%, it's like we are all spoiled by having the 1% working at Bain. And so it was valuable for me when I was outside of Bain to be working in a couple of companies where, you had a bell curve of capability, like you sort of dealing with the reality of the workforce. And, having myself struggled at that point with what skills did I not learn all the way through my getting to partner at Bain that all of a sudden seemed to be needed.
Yeah.
And so long story short, when my conclusion or my hypothesis even then was, I think what people are really talking about is, what else do we need to teach them besides how to do this job that is going to help them be able to create, maintain, nourish, more healthier and more exciting relationships. Because at the end of the day, working together, leading people, sort of getting motivating groups to do things, in my opinion, is really saying, how do you make those into great relationships? Otherwise, nothing happens. So I thought there was something there around how do you actually think about, articulate, and teach relationship skills, especially to people who are mostly, left brain analytic, brains on a stick kind of people. Or at least that's the assumption, right? The outside in assumption.
Yeah.
And certainly at that point at Bain, when we looked at the training, development, formal and informal mentoring, and all the tools that we had around that, lo and behold, if you sort of thought about how much of that was oriented towards teaching technical skill, what in my model now we call performance related skills, and how much was around relationships, including with yourself, which we now call the inspirational skills and personal capacity. And I'll come back and explain. There's basically, we talk about 3 major components of leadership. What was the weighting between those things? And it was like 99% performance, 1% everything else. And that was the big light bulb for me, which is, oh, okay, well, no wonder we have people starting to feel uncomfortable, both the givers and the receivers, if you want to think about it that way, of leadership, are feeling like they're not getting everything that they could. And that's because we're really over-indexed on only one of 3 categories of things that matter.
Well, and I think
so we should do something about that.
Yeah, and I think that isn't, you're not unique in that. I think in lots of the organizations that that I've worked with in the past, they tend to over-index on those hard skills, because the soft skills, either they seem soft, or they're just so mushy and unknown that it's really hard for particularly, I think, senior leadership to get their hands grasped around it and saying, so what is the benefit of teaching some of these more relationship skills outside, unless it's how do you sell to this type of person, but more of the general component. So
this came up in a conversation we had with Todd Fonseca, the Vice President of Clinical Research at Medtronic, and he works a lot on leadership development and it tries to bring new emphasis to these soft skills, to these relationship skills, because they are underplayed and undervalued. Mark, so could you walk us through the inspirational leader model that you've got? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So to your point about the weighting, we very strongly would agree with you and the other gentleman that you mentioned that the time has come, I think, and increasingly so, where the basic paradigm of how you think about leadership needs to kind of evolve to its next stage. And if I'm sure if you're aware of the history of, formal management really just started around right after World War II, the organization man and so forth. So it actually hasn't even been through that many cycles, but we're starting to see more and more companies like you mentioned, Medtronic and others, starting to realize that if they don't actually take on this rebalancing, that they're going to be left behind, and it's going to be a problem. So I'm excited that we're maybe a little bit out ahead of others in trying to figure out a more systematic way to address this. So the model itself starts with what I mentioned earlier, that we want people to understand that if you're thinking about yourself in your capacity as a leader, and again, by leader, we don't mean hierarchical leader, we mean influencer, motivator, whatever other adjectives you want to use. That if you really want to do that and you want to develop yourself to your fullest, you still have to care about your performance skills, the 3 categories. You still have to care about those, because at least in an organizational context, and even if it's a nonprofit or a social mission that you want to do, if you don't get outcomes that are relevant and sustainable, you're kind of dead in the water. So, learning, paying attention to and learning how to do the best you can to develop the skills required at whatever point in your career, whatever the role is, those don't go away. But just getting great at those is nowhere near sufficient to really reach full potential as a leader. And that frankly, in our environment, that's a big aha for many of our people who think that especially the more old school, who think that everybody is excited to match your level of formal success. That's a huge motivator, and it actually, it never really has been, but it's also been typical in many, certainly Western corporations, that that's, people expect that is motivating to the next wave, and it sort of self-perpetuates, and that's just broken down, I think.
Is the Peter Drucker model of management dead?
Well, it depends which parts of his model. I think the hierarchical, sort of his components of hierarchical leadership are, I don't know that they're dead, but I think there's many more models of how organizations operate than that anymore. I mean, that may be becoming the minority model,
Yeah.
but it's top down and very hierarchical, and where roles are quite, relatively fixed and so forth. You're aware of all the trend toward adopting agile approaches to lots of different things. Bain is one of those entities, but the more you move towards cross-functional or even cross-company activity as what's actually needed to get things done, the more you move towards almost being in co-creative process with your customers, instead of we're going to just make what we want and then convince you to buy it.
Yeah.
The more you have to do those things to actually be successful and be effective, the less a top-down formal hierarchy where the controls get handed down from the top and everybody has their little box, those just break down.
Right.
Now, Drucker, you're probably more versed in Drucker than I am, given your backgrounds, but he also did spend a lot of time talking about the interpersonal side of things, but that's not generally what he's.
Yeah.
He certainly did care. He knew that.
Yes.
It was people. Well, ultimately, it's people and their behaviors that are what executes the vision of the organization. It's not just all in our.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, Mark,
So we tell you, back to the model. So the three parts of the model, we tell people performance is kind of is necessary but not sufficient. Don't forget about doing those. And in a way, it's a little bit of a dig at the idea that you can just be a fantastic, socially adept, glad-hander, and somehow that's a substitute for performance skills. We certainly don't believe that at Bain. But what we then say is there's two other categories that you should be paying attention to, and our assertion is that those are not actually sort of icing on the cake, but are more and more really part of the core of what you have to be doing in some sort of reasonable balance with performance if you really want to succeed. So the second bucket we call the inspirational skills. That's, some people would call that the soft skills, et cetera. But our whole approach was to see if we could take a well-structured, analytically sound, sort of more comprehensive approach to how we would define, measure, explain, teach, create dialogue around those soft skills, so that it didn't become so mushy and kind of qualitative, which was our feeling as we looked at our own, what we were doing up to that point, and looking around the world of leadership development methodologies. We felt that they were they didn't have the analytical rigor that, you know, we would like, especially given that we're in the business of being analytically rigorous.
Yes.
So, and I'll explain how we came up with that in a minute if you want, how we define those skills and why that we think that's actually quite unique, at least at this point in some of the other leadership models we've seen. And then the third category we call personal capacity, and we describe that as the set of physiological, psychological, and practical skills that you need to learn and adopt that will allow you to have the resilience and stamina to sustain high performance on those other two, across those other two categories. You can look at that another way in a very broad sense and say, this is the stuff that you actually need to have in your skill building mix as well in order to have a truly sustainable career. If you define sustainability as not just, you know, sort of being able to fall over the goal line at some point with some amount of money in your account, but also, you know, are you enjoying yourself along the way? Are you getting energy out of what you're doing? Are you actually, you know, maintaining your both your mental and physical health so that the work that you're doing isn't literally sucking the life out of you? Are you connecting what you're doing with your purpose and all these kinds of other things that, again, as you guys said, these aren't new ideas. Like they've been out there in the world, of course, for a long time. But what we think was very different about what we did is we have put a stake in the ground saying those need to move from the world of optional, nice to have kind of, you know, if it strikes you as being interesting, go for it kinds of things. You know, maybe you're interested in that, maybe you're not. We're trying to move from that to say, if you actually care about being an effective leader, you must spend some time on all of these things. It's not really optional.
So Mark, tell us a little bit, you mentioned the analytical process of getting to the inspirational leadership skill.
Yes.
Tell us about that process that you use, because I think from our discussions before, it is a little bit unique from, I think, many of the other leadership models out there that have a more qualitative bent to it. This is a very quantitative, analytical approach.
Yes.
So help us understand what you guys did.
Yes. So if you start out with if you ask anybody the question of think of somebody that inspired you and what was it about them that made you feel inspired, and you don't have to define what that feels like. It's kind of like love, however you're thinking about it. And you ask them what it was. I mean, you take any group of people and spend about a minute, and you could end up with a list of 50 or 60, you know, sort of behaviors or attributes, right? They're very humble. They have a low ego. They listen really well. They care about me, you know, on and on. And when you scour as much as possible the research and thinking that's been done, which I would argue goes back pretty much to the first philosophers, about you know, well, what are the elements of good relationships? What drives, you know, meaningful connection with people, etc. Separate from the business context, just in general, there's a zillion ideas out there, right? And people have come at it from a philosophical bent, from a behavioral science bent, from a sociology bent, from a religious or spiritual. So it almost seems like it's so open-ended and unstructured, as you said, and that it does feel squishy. And, you know, and I think that's why, as we began to search for, has anybody done the analytics that we thought were logical to try and decide or determine, well, is there some reasonable set of those things that if you were to put a stake in the ground around that would be big enough to capture what is true about human relationships, which is that they're complex and they can't really be boiled down to sort of an optimization formula like maximizing the number of chickens that come off of your production line. So is there a way to figure out how to bound that in a broad enough way that you have the richness you need to accommodate what's real for all of us as we think about this, and that is that there's lots of different ways that people are and feel inspired, but yet narrow enough that you could think about building a training and development and feedback system to help support people learning and building those skills that would be just as robust as we and most other companies have around teaching people what they have to do their performance skills.
Yeah.
So that was the question that we asked ourselves, and we scoured around hoping that someone had already figured that out and that we could adopt their approach. And honestly, what we found, I can't say that I was able to find every single piece of writing that may have ever been done on this, but I went through a lot of them, and there were two things that struck me as being missing from a lot of the other approaches to leadership development or this topic out there. The first, ironically, was almost nobody, if you read a lot of these books about leadership, almost nobody actually has adopted a customer-driven perspective and or research methodology around these skills. So, and that was super antithetical to me as a Bain person, because one of the major things we work with lots of our clients on is how do you actually really understand what the customer needs, and how do you know what the voice of the customer is, and how do you adjust your value proposition to meet those needs? Like, that's kind of business 101. And yet when you read a lot of the leadership books and even a lot of the academic approaches, they seem to always just zero in on the leader and try and, through mostly, I think, qualitative judgment, discern what they think that leader or group of leaders is doing that is seemingly having the inspirational effect. And most of the time they're zeroing in on people who, by definition, have already risen to where they are influential over many, 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 many people.
Yeah.
So they're not dealing with the ordinary experience that most of us have, which is, I don't know about you, but I've never met John Kennedy, Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, Steve Jobs. Name any of the people in these books. I've never met them, and yet I feel like I've been inspired by a lot of people in my life.
Yeah.
So they tend to pick I think a non-representative sample. They focus on the leaders, and then they kind of qualitatively judge what the factors are that are present. And then, so they don't, I've only seen literally a couple of leadership researchers who seem to have spent any time going to, for lack of a better word, the followers or the recipients or the customers, and trying to discern what is it that's driving their reaction. So that was one missing thing, is this customer perspective. And then the other missing thing was that the choice, if you picked anybody's solution, so go on Amazon and type in leadership books, and many of them have a title that sounds like the blank lessons in leadership of blank.
Yeah.
Right. And so how did they pick the blank? Like, and it was interesting, because in most cases it seemed literally random, like, well, this is all they could find in the set of people they were looking for commonalities among, or these were the ones that just sounded really pithy, or, to be a little bit more cynical, the editors of these publishers said, like, you can't have more than 7 because that resonates, in the title of a book, or whatever the reason is. It didn't seem particularly scientific. Let's just put it that way. So what we said was, okay, if we're gonna be able to approach this with the rigor that we are talking about, and trying to meet those 2 objectives I mentioned of broad enough to be useful, narrow enough to be doable or supportable, we have to come up with a customer-driven way to figure this out. So we took a lot of these ideas, and a lot of the words, many of the words are synonymous or related. So we spent a lot of time trying to whittle down a really broad set of ideas to a manageable number. And then we did a giant conjoint study, which for any of the listeners that know marketing or have done especially consumer product design, you know, it's, you take all these attributes and you get people to rank and rate them against each other. And our goal was to see how many of these passed the one arbitrary test, I would say, in our whole methodology, which was, we said, if any of these are deemed to be relevant in the eyes of our customers, and our original conjoint study was, of course, done on the Bain population at all levels, including administrative and consulting and everything else. So we had, it was interesting, we fielded the survey. We had an employee population at the time of about 6,000. Our normal response rate to an internal survey is, you know, 600 people, 10%, everybody's excited.
That's okay.
We actually had almost 4,000 people took the time to fill this out, and it took about 40 minutes. It was a long survey.
Ooh.
So right there, we knew we were onto something that people cared a lot about wanting us to address. Anyway, so we did this conjoint, and our rule was any of these attributes that move the needle for someone on saying that they feel inspired when they're working with another Bain person. If 20% of the population says that factor is, you know, matters, then we want to include it in our model.
Okay.
So you know,
how did you pick 20%? Just out of curiosity, how did
well, that was as I said, that probably is the kind of most random, I would say, single most random. There were two judgment calls in creating this. One was, you know, we started with a gigantic list of attributes and ideas and behaviors that we thought affected relationships, gathered from all these different sources, and we had to make some judgments about what went into the survey. So we made a pretty big cut that was arguably judgmental. I had a panel of people, and we spent several, you know, many weeks, days at a time, literally staring at these things and trying to decide if they were the same as something else and could be merged and so forth before we created the survey. And that was one choice. The second choice of 20% was honestly based on the Bain, the way we do business. So Bain works in project teams, and our typical project team would have a leader, either a manager or a partner, and something like 5 to 6 people on the team. So our logic was, you know, if you think about creating a broad inspirational impact, you know, for if any of us are trying to create an inspirational impact, it's essentially a probability game, right? It's what's the probability that if I'm involved in relationship with this group of people, that I am somehow going to be showing up and have what they need, right, to feel inspired. And so we basically said, well, you know, we hope that there's at least one thing that's inspirational to each person on a team. So that would mean 1 out of 5.
Oh, yeah.
So that's how we picked 20%.
That makes sense.
And you know, it's interesting because since we've been doing this, and we now have, you know, 15,000 or so of the survey vehicle that then now asks people explicitly about the set that we've chosen, and we ended up choosing from that process 32 elements. We call those the inspirational skill set, is 32 different attributes and behaviors. And now we routinely in the survey, and we update and we just redo the analytics frequently. We ask people, you know, how important is this particular item in you feeling inspired? So we're constantly we're constantly trying to make sure that all of these, the 32 that we picked, you know, are still passing the 20% rule. And you know, but that's been very, very stable from the beginning of this. It's we're 4 years into this now. So we're pretty sure we've picked a good enough group of attributes. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that there's something that might be inspirational to a given person about another person that isn't on our list. But if you think about what we're trying to do as something that can be driven as a formal leadership model, leadership competency model,
Yeah.
when I think about it that way, across, a large organization, there's just no way you're going to get every possible permutation that's, might be relevant. So that's how we picked 32. So we still think that's quite unique out there. We haven't seen, I have yet still to see research, broad research that honestly tries to treat people as the customers of their leaders in general. And certainly with respect specifically to this aspect of inspiration, I haven't seen that either. So we think it's pretty unique.
So Mark, you have the 32 characteristics, and probably can't get into those, but I know that you have segmented those into kind of bigger buckets of areas. Can you help us understand what you've done with that, and then the whole concept of centeredness? I know that was a big piece when we talked last time.
Yes. So the first, really, in my mind, actually the most exciting analytic finding of the whole process was once we had the 32 elements chosen, then the next logical question was, well, how do you think about the impact of those elements on driving inspiration? Like, what's the connection between those? And the biggest concern, I would say, that I had and many others after we put this list forward is, oh my God, we can't even keep up with learning the 5 things that we have to learn to survive in our job. Yeah. Now you're telling me that there's 32 other things, and these are like really kind of soft, and I'm supposed to learn how to all of those and how to be great at all of those, and forget it. I mean, this just is a non-starter. And our hypothesis again was, well, I don't think that's actually true. That's the call it the collective set of things that matter to a collective group of people. That doesn't necessarily mean that the impact of any single individual is that for an individual to have impact, that they need to actually be doing all 32 of those things at a high level all the time. Because that also is inconsistent with our own personal experience, both as a giver and receiver, right? Nobody's perfect, and nobody does all that stuff all the time, anyway. Nobody does I don't know a person that can do all 32 of those things. At least I've never met them. And, even some of the major towering figures in history of inspiration, it's been well documented that some of them are incredibly bad at some of those things too. Right, but yet still highly inspirational. So we had this hypothesis that the answer wasn't that you had to know all of them, but we really didn't know with any analytics, well, how do these really relate to being inspirational? So what we did is we created this idea of what we did know was that, or at least we felt pretty strongly, and lots of people have documented this. I know you've probably documented this in your work, that what does stand out for people about other people is when they have a handful of things that are really spiky, as opposed to, they're just kind of bland and they just fade into the woodwork. That's kind of that's kind of a precondition to really having an inspirational impact on someone else, is that there's something about you that stands out for them. So we had this idea that, that if we could calibrate in some way this idea of spikiness, and then try and see how do those spikes then correlate to the customer's perception of inspiration. Maybe we could figure out, what is the, I guess, optimal, if you want to call it that, what's the bogey within those 32 things? What's a realistic bogey if you really want to have a high impact that people should shoot for in learning and trying to develop those? So we created a scale that, we created a 360 survey. We created a scale, and I won't go into all the details behind that, but what we ended up doing was saying, we will give you credit for having we call it distinguishing strength, i.e. a spike on these 32 elements, if in the 360 feedback that comes back from our survey across all of your respondents if you are essentially viewed as being in the top decile in their experience relative to other people they've experienced. So we built that survey to calculate that essentially.
And what about those folks who do not have those spikes? What if there are no material spikes in their 360 profile?
Well, this is what's interesting. So the first big insight out of this is if you start with the correlation of distinguishing strengths to inspiration, and inspiration measured by the followers, the way the survey works, when working with Mark, I feel inspired, 0 for uninspired, 5 to super inspired.
Right.
If you correlate the number of those distinguishing strengths in any given person's profile with the percentage of people that say they felt inspired, if you have 0 of those distinguishing strengths, the percentage of people that say they're inspired is still about a third.
Okay.
And there's a nuance to that I can explain, but the bottom line is that what that points out, of course, is 2 different things. One, that this is not an optimization game. It's it's a probability game, and so that 33% in my mind partially represents the fact that you can't account with any given subset of factors for 100% of the possible drivers of inspiration. And
right.
So in a way I feel heartened that even with none you're still kind of batting 300. The other though is that we're looking at we have a bit of a skewed sample because the 360 survey data that we have really only consists of, at Bain, the people that have already reached the manager role.
Okay.
So they've kind of gotten to the point of being in charge of a bunch of other people. And likewise, we've run probably 500 or 600 of these now with non-Bain organizations. But again, it's always been people that have already, gotten to some type of formal leadership role. And so you have to figure that they're doing at least some stuff right,
Right.
Could be.
To have gotten there. But so that's sort of one finding. But the more exciting part of it was, as soon as you get even one of these in your profile, that percentage rose to 68%. And as soon as you get to 4, it was over 90. It was, I think, 91% the last time we calibrated it. So, and then it actually keeps going up. We have some people in our database that, according to the survey, might have spikes on 15 of these things. But it's very, it tails off pretty quick. So the curve rises very quickly, which also, I think, if you think about it, it is intuitively obvious after the fact. It rises very quickly in terms of the impact when you can add just a few into your portfolio, and then it can keep going up, but it's a much shallower curve.
So in that component, Mark, what I'm hearing you say, so if I have a distinguishing characteristic or a spike, even one. So for instance, I think some of your inspiration, there's a humility one. So if people
Right.
view, wow, Kurt is really has a big thing of humility, that
Correct.
often my likelihood of being inspirational just significantly goes up. And if I have 2, 3,
Right.
4 of those, then that's, so for instance, some of these others are focus and vision and shared ambition and unselfishness. So some of those components. And so if people say, well, Kurt really has these distinguishing characteristics and 4 of them, just having 4 of those, I'm much more likely to be viewed as an inspirational leader than if I had 0 or even just 1.
This is hypothetical, right, Kurt?
Well, yeah,
Yes, that's exactly right. That's what the data says. And the other nuance, which was also quite exciting in my mind, is the next level down in our rating scale we call potential distinguishing strengths.
Okay.
And we made the cutoff for that the next 2 deciles. So, if you're kind of in the top 30% rated on those, we call those potential distinguishing strengths, because the follow-on part of our program, which I know you would be intimately familiar with behavior change and so forth, is to get people into the mindset of identifying and building on authentic strengths as a way to create those spikes, not trying to use their left brain and sort of optimize, well, which of these 32 do I think is going to give me the most ROI? And even if it's completely alien to me as a human being, I'm going to somehow get into the top decile. Like, what's incredibly exciting to me about this, in addition to that first finding, is that when you look across, thousands of respondents now on this survey, there's virtually nobody that doesn't end up with several of these that are already in that potential distinguishing strength category.
That's cool.
Which in any other world other than Bain, if you told somebody you've got like 5 things that are already in the top quartile, they just aren't in the top decile, they would think that's awesome. But Bain people, for high achievers, like they're like, oh my God, I failed.
Oh man.
So, but the exciting part for me, obviously, is what this brings out very explicitly for virtually everybody is, you're actually an awesome person. Like, you have a bunch of good stuff going on that you might, in many cases I find they aren't even aware of or willing to give themselves credit for, almost in a strange way. And so, it's very, very, very rare. And again, we have a little bit of a skewed sample because we already have people that if they really had glaring weaknesses across all of these things, they probably would not have ever even made it
Right.
as far as made it. So it's a little bit of a skewed sample, but for people that are managing other people, at least I would say, it's virtually 100% certain that you have way more going for you than you have thought about. And therefore you've got an amazing pile of raw material to build your spikes out of. All you actually have to do is get comfortable with that being who you really are, and then invest in the ways that we try and teach people, some of which we're trying to use some tips and tricks from your behavioral science world, to get people to change their behavior, to actually build these things stronger and stronger to the point where at some point they will pop up as distinguished.
Well, and so that leads me to my next question, which is, this is a podcast that focuses in on behavioral science. So what are those behavioral science elements that you either integrated in when you were thinking about the model, or I think more impactful for me is thinking about what you just were talking about. So how do you then apply some of those behavioral science principles to get people from that potential up into that distinguished component? Well,
I'm afraid to answer this question since you guys are experts and I'm not. So feel free to teach me if I've misinterpreted some of these. But there's 2 or 3 different things that we're at least trying to incorporate into our program.
Okay.
The first, as I mentioned at the very beginning, which is probably the most intriguing part to me, just given my personal mindset, is this idea of that there's lots of acknowledgement that real, I guess you would say, real excitement, real internal energy, real positive feeling, fulfillment, all of those kinds of things, particularly in a work environment, are really that at the end of the day, they really need to be driven by intrinsic motivation to be kind of real and powerful.
Okay.
And that at least this is how I interpreted a lot of the stuff I read, and that certainly resonated with me because I when people say it, when some of my colleagues say to me, well, but really we should just call it motivation. We should call inspiration. Should have called it motivational leadership. And I'm like, well, that makes no sense to me, because if I told you that if you didn't go to this client meeting, I'm going to kill your dog, you'd probably be motivated to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not what we're talking about, right? And he's like, oh yeah, I never thought of that. So I've always been very intrigued by this idea of intrinsic motivation, and at least as I interpreted a lot of the research, the conundrum is that there's quite a bit of research that shows that when it's high, good things happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there seems to be consensus among the experts that it's way more powerful, obviously, than external motivation. But there, I did not find a really long list of here's the successful interventions one can use that have been proven to actually move the needle on intrinsic motivation.
Yeah. Stimulating intrinsic motivation is terribly
really hard.
Yeah.
So my takeaway from that was, okay, there's no silver bullet. That's obvious.
Mm-hmm.
So what we need to try and do is, I guess, philosophically, what we want to try and do is create as rich a, if you want to think about it, create as rich a soil mix as we can, so that these little seedlings that we have here can, be planted there, and they will pull whichever nutrients, are most useful to them inside, and hopefully that will, that will be the way that they end up connecting the dots between what's intrinsically motivating to them and what we can hopefully offer to support, those things getting more and more used or more present.
And
so
now,
we
I see the hook back to visual and environmental studies, because you're talking about environment now, right?
Right, exactly. And so our goal with the program, and I honestly, I don't think we've got the perfect solution, and we're always trying to learn and, add and try new things that we hear about. So I would love for you guys to make me aware of what's new and interesting that we maybe can weave in. But philosophically, our approach to this is we tell people, look, the Inspirational Leadership Program, it's not a training program in the sense that you're used to thinking about it. I'm going to sit down, they're going to show me some PowerPoints. I'm really smart, so I'm going to figure this out in about an hour. And then, then I know I can do it. We're trying to say to people, this is kind of a journey that starts and probably doesn't ever really end. We call our onboarding sessions literally welcome sessions, because we're welcoming you to, the world of thinking and trying to be more of these things, as opposed to IL training.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever anybody says I'm going to an IL training, I say, well, then you probably shouldn't come to ours, because that's not what we do. But so we've tried to get across that this is really about you as a person.
Yeah.
We message that as aggressively as we can, trying to get to the level where hopefully we've somehow touched on their intrinsic motivation things. So we spend a lot of time saying this isn't about Bain. It's not this stuff does not directly tie. We do not directly tie this to any of our explicit rating, promotion, or compensation programs. We think there's lots of indirect benefit you'll get, but we constantly trying to reinforce that this is an investment that the firm is trying to make in helping you. And and so we're kind of trying to do the best we can to trigger as many neurons as we can on that intrinsic side, and then hope that they get excited and motivated to just at least want to engage in the concepts. And then in the follow-on learning part, we're trying to adopt a lot of the stuff from behavioral science around, experiential learning opportunities, and how do you create the, hopefully mostly visible, we can get them to be more visible in the day-to-day at Bain. How do you create more visible feedback channels so that when people do some of this stuff, it's actually recognized and they get that positive feedback loop going, which is then what creates that experiential, hopefully the positive experiential learning. So I would say thinking a lot about intrinsic motivation, trying to create experiential learning, and trying to be as varied and just sort of interesting and fun and cool as we can in the various touch points that we can do.
Yeah,
So those are the three.
that recognition or that feedback loop and getting that dopamine release and various different things. But it also sounds very much like you're having people explore their self-identity and the self-schemas that they have about themselves, and then tapping into, are your behaviors reflective of those, and what are those behaviors that you need to have more visible, as you said, or more explicit out in your work environment. And sometimes I think people feel like they can't necessarily share their authentic self because of whatever the history that we have of our journey in life, of saying, oh, well, you need to keep that part of yourself. Leaders aren't humble, right? Leaders
Right.
and you can, in what you're saying,
Leaders.
yeah. So I think there's a lot. Leaders are more complex, and there's a component of that is saying, let's allow this element of your self-identity and these self-schemas that you have in these various different components to actually flourish, and allow that to happen through this experiential component of getting people to practice and do that. I think it's a nice model that really allows, I think, a more genuine approach to this than you're not learning these are the 5 steps to be an effective leader.
Yeah. It's way more complex than that, which is super cool as far as I'm concerned. This has really been a great conversation, Mark. I'm really glad that we've been able to record this and share this with our listeners.
Yeah.
And we need to talk more about how we can integrate behavioral sciences into your
Yes.
model.
Yeah.
Well, we should definitely have a whiteboard session on that for sure. So
There we go.
we'll have to work out how that goes. One of my rocks is co-creation, so I'm an easy sell.
There you go.
Oh man, love that. We're on the same page. But before we go, we have to talk about my favorite subject, which is music.
It's
Now.
Yeah.
Kurt said you won't have to actually sing your favorite song, but I was thinking maybe we should try it. No, I'm just kidding. No.
Yeah. Thank you for sparing me that, or sparing your listeners.
Yes. So one of the things that we, behavioral grooves, we have this groove component, grooves in records, and as Tim always asked, so if there was a song or a genre of music that is reflective of you as an individual or something, how would you describe your musical inspiration, as we talk about here? We're talking inspirational leadership. What's your inspirational music?
Well, I actually, my very, very, very favorite song of all time is Celluloid Heroes by the KINKS.
Oh, yes.
Wow.
I don't know if you're familiar with that particular song, but that song, and songs that have that same idea in them, but that one in particular has just resonated with me ever since I first heard it back in my high school days in the 70s. And if you know that song, it's kind of on the surface, it's about Hollywood and the fleetingness, if that's a word, of fame and fortune and so forth. But the theme that I always took out of it was this idea. There's a line in there even that everybody's a hero and everybody's a star.
Yeah.
And for me, the takeaway was we all have within us the ability to be and do something great. And the key is actually not to focus on what I'm going to get from John Q. Public or the vagaries of fame, but think about and be who you are, be authentic, and it's in there somewhere, but you may have to go look for it and find it.
Yeah, there was a line, if you covered him with garbage, George Sanders would still have style. This
exactly
sort of this self-effacing or self-fulfilling element of just be who you are, and you'll penetrate through whatever immediate circumstances you're in. Is a pretty yeah.
So I've always loved that song, and I listen to it all the time.
Well, good.
That's terrific.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for your time. This has been fascinating. I am hopefully we can our listeners will think so as well. We'll link to in the show notes. We'll link to the Bain model. It's up on Bain's website there, and so we'll link to that so people can actually look at the PDF of that and kind of understand a little bit better as we're talking through it. So with that, though, thank you, and we appreciate it.
Welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our Behavioral Grooves interview, have a free-flowing discussion on some of those topics, and whatever else comes into our shiny little heads. Or I guess my head is the only shiny little head. Yours isn't so shiny and maybe not so little.
And what if the conversation wasn't free-flowing? What would that be like? What if it was jagged?
Then we would probably lose many of our listeners. So Tim, what was the key pieces of information that you found absolutely fascinating with Mark's conversation?
To go from visual and environmental studies and be really committed to it. Mark was not in school to be a brown bagger. He was there. He was very committed to this. And I think about and we even talked about this, the Buckminster Fuller comment about don't change the man, change the environment.
Yeah.
And I think that was just fascinating how he took that and really started to look at how environment impacts management, impacts our culture, the corporate culture, impacts leadership.
Well, and I think it's interesting to that note is having that broader perspective and not having necessarily a specific business degree. And then he talked about when he did meet Bill Bain, the founder of Bain, and he said, what was it? Something along like, you're the first person I've interviewed who actually seems to understand what I'm talking about and what we're doing here.
Yeah.
Because of that breadth of education that I got. I think that helped. Obviously, Mark is a very bright guy and can capture things on the moment, but I think that diversity in background is an interesting component. And it's one of those things I think maybe education today, we tend to focus in on what are we going to do? You got to pick your major in order to get your job, right? And what is it that's driving that? Why can't we have a more, egalitarian, humanities component?
Well, this is a big question, right? I mean, this has been on our minds here recently. We've talked about this, but there is that question of are people going to business school for the specific utility of a certain value, monetary value once they graduate? Like
Yes.
starting salary being the key measure. And so with accounting degrees and engineering degrees or maybe even economic degrees, there might be some straight line. But what about a marketing degree? Or what about a liberal arts degree?
Yes.
How do we measure the utility? Or if our measure is economic utility, how are we going to measure that?
Well, and is economic utility the right measure? Should we be looking at overall life satisfaction? And how do you measure overall life satisfaction? And you left out psychology. How could you leave out psychology? Come on.
Because I was a marketing major. I was not a psychology major.
I did a marketing MBA. That was my MBA. Come on. We got all of that.
Well, Mark even talked about that when he talked about cross-functional activities and cross-company activities and the need to kind of break away from these silos. And I thought that was an important thing to remind us of, that we solve problems most effectively when we have diverse viewpoints in the room.
Yeah.
Right. As companies get more siloed, get larger and get more siloed, we lose that cross-functional, cross-company effect of having lots of ideas come in to influence our decision-making.
It reminds me of the conversation we had with James Heyman in his podcast, where he was talking about you don't have departments based around solving a question. You have departments around certain functional areas. And wouldn't it be great if you had an entire group of people from marketing, from economics, from sociology, from psychology, who are all looking at how judgments are made, as opposed to, oh no, that's a economics perspective, or economics is looking at it from one perspective, psychology is looking at it from another, sociology is looking at it from another, and marketing is looking at it from a fourth way, and they're all different, and they don't have any of the overlap that you could get some of that synergy and some of the insights from.
And those insights only come when you bring these different fields together, these different expertise. So at once we have to have, the call is for individual expertise, but to be at the table with people with a variety of different expertises, right?
And being open to listening and hearing and building off of those synergies.
Yeah.
So,
okay, so what about emotional utility, Kern? How about that? I know there's no segue there, right? I'm sorry.
That was from a podcast a long time ago, wasn't it? Or maybe just a week ago. I don't know.
Yeah,
But yeah, emotional utility is one of those functions that we could look at from the perspective of what you're trying to maximize
right.
in a career choice in your college education. I think there's something to be said there. So one of the things that I found, to take us back into an actual grooving session about some of the topics we talked about, was the methodology that Mark used in looking at leadership, right? It was
the development of the Bain model.
The development of the model, and he brought up the fact that Bain has a very quantitative, make sure I say that right, approach to these things, right? And so it's not the soft fuzzy, although that's important, but you need to be able to quantify that and to put some components around that. So when they're looking at that retention and engagement and seeing that what was used to work and now it's not, and trying to figure that out, they took a very analytical approach to it, which is very much like what we do in research. And you're looking at trying to identify the root causes of things, and not just necessarily correlations, and not just understanding, well, hey, there's these two factors that show up together all the time, therefore, that's going to be, one's going to cause the other. You really need to understand what is causing it, what are those factors. So
more data can help that.
More data can help that.
Better data can help that.
And looking at it in a rigorous way, looking at it in a way that you test your hypothesis, right? You have hypothesis out there, you test that, you look to see if the hypothesis stands the test of the scrutiny of the data and the analysis around it. And then from there, you make adjustments. And that's what the process that they use.
Yeah. On a similar note, I was happy to come across a paper this morning, that an academic paper that tested a hypothesis and found there was really only the weakest of correlation between what they were trying to prove. I'm not going to, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, because academics like to say, well, I found something, and this is what I found, and it's a robust effect. They're always talking about the robust effect. But unless you actually have some tests that fail, or to go back to, I should move away from the fail. We have some learnings. We have some learning opportunities.
Yes, we do.
We have learning opportunities when we discover that things don't go as expected.
Well, I just want to let you know that if you ever want another one of those to read, you can read my dissertation.
Oh,
there you go. My hypothesis was totally, was not confirmed. So.
Okay. Well, with that,
another interesting part that I thought about from this conversation with Mark was one line that he said, where they were looking at the components of in the past of how they were training and looking at leadership, and 99% of that was based on performance, and only 1% was everything else.
Everything else.
Yeah, and he said, you know, as a big light bulb for me, no wonder we have people, quote unquote, starting to feel uncomfortable, because it's not all about performance, right?
Yeah.
Performance is a part, which he mentions, right?
Yeah.
Performance is a big part. You can't forget about that from a leadership aspect.
And even at that, there is no silver bullet.
No, right.
Right.
But it's more than just leadership. It's more than just the performance aspect of it. And I think too many companies, I've worked with too many companies. We look at this from sales incentives. We look at this in a variety of other ways.
Employee engagement.
Employee engagement. And what is being measured is a performance measure, which is an output-based measure. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's important.
Absolutely.
However, there are inputs into that drive a significant amount of that output performance. And without those inputs and making sure that those inputs are being done right, you're missing some very important pieces. And I think that's something that Mark and his team found and really identified.
Well, the stuff that's left on the sidelines, the elements that are not fully considered or weighed, sort of become externalities that still have an effect on the result.
Yeah.
So just because we're not carefully paying attention to them and integrating them into the models doesn't mean they're not having an effect.
That's true.
The better model is kind of getting back to the data-driven, the quantitative side of this. The more data that we can have in these models, hopefully the more effective they'll be.
And what I liked about Mark is they're continuing to add data from new people coming in and taking their assessments and various different things, and they're continuing to look at the model. So I think it's only going to improve over time. Peter Drucker and his management model, what did you think of Mark's response to that?
Well, it did surprise me, actually, a little bit. He was very inclusive about it, even though he's in the business of saying, the new model that I just created is the new model.
Yeah.
This is kind of the definitive thing. But, you know, Mark acknowledged that there are behavioral aspects of what Drucker was focused on that are still alive and well and should be considered.
Yeah. I think that's very interesting. It was, and to a degree, there's components of that, right? Where depending upon what part of the model you're looking at, and how you interpret that from a Peter Drucker perspective, right? There are parts of that still go into that performance part of the overall equation. It's just this factor of saying it's not the end all be all of it. And I think that was very apparent and I think very appropriate. So, all right. You want to talk some music?
I would love to talk some music.
What do you want to talk about music?
Well, I was thinking about, the KINKS don't come up a lot in conversation.
What do you mean the KINKS don't come up in a lot of conversation? The KINKS are one of the seminal bands from that era.
Truly. So I have just a personal reflection to make on the KINKS, and I'm a fan going way back. But when I heard the song Lola. Mm-hmm. And to hear it was about this guy, this cross-dressing guy, what an amazing topic to write a song about.
When was that? That was
early 1970s. I'm betting this was 1970, maybe 71, somewhere in there. If someone else is faster at Google than we are, and somebody should send us a note on that, but to make sure that we get that in the notes. But it's one of the things that I really love about music is sometimes pushing the boundaries. And at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, recently there were some really great inductees. Nina Simone was among them.
Oh.
And she's a woman who, as a tremendously talented and highly trained pianist and songwriter, wrote songs that kind of pushed the political and social boundaries of her time in a way that was provocative, but done in brilliant music. And so if you're not familiar with Nina Simone, I just want to direct you to check it out. And if you haven't heard Lola by the KINKS, by God, do yourself a favor and dial it up on YouTube, because it's a great tune.
Lola.
Lo, 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 lo. Okay.
Yeah.
How about you, Kurt?
And so it was. I'm looking it up.
You're looking at cheating.
Wikipedia in 1970.
1970.
Yeah,
Okay.
the KINKS debuted Lola. An account of a confused, according to Wikipedia, an account of a confused romantic encounter with a transvestite that became both a UK and US top 10 hit. The lyrics originally contained the word Coca-Cola, and as a result, the BBC refused to broadcast the song, considering it to be in violation of their policy against product placement.
Oh, snap.
So they changed it to Cherry Cola.
Yes.
What other famous rock song had that happen?
Had the same kind of I'm not
The Rolling Stones?
with what?
Isn't it the Rolling Stones? Now I'm saying it and I might be wrong. Where he talks about Cherry Cola. Man, I thought for sure you would know this, and now I'm drawing a blank. Anyway, let's move on.
Gotta move on. Quick.
All right. And with that, I think I just ruined my entire musical component. So that was
Okay, well, that's good enough.
that was good enough.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, folks.
For listening in again.
Yeah, and sorry this ending was a little mixed up and groovy. If we research whatever we just talked about, and we'll put it in the show notes.
And just one little thing. We don't have any listeners in Saudi Arabia. So if you know anybody in Saudi Arabia, would you just give them a little nudge and, ask them to start signing up, because that's one of the places that's just not lit up on the map. So, FYI.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening.